So this third video deals with the other main issue which is covered in this week's readings. Besides the anti-nuclear movement, we have the worldwide non-violent campaign for boycott, divestment and sanctions on Israel. Now that's a form of advocacy, it's a form of activism. Is it peace activism? That's a good question and a good debate. But I'll show you some of the factors that lie behind it. And one of them can be glimpsed in a rather famous picture, or famous composite picture, which is this, which is a map of what is sometimes called the amazing disappearing Palestine. And the green shaded areas show the land available for Palestinians in 1947, then from 1948 to 67, and then the third one is 99. And you can see how the amount of land for Palestinians has been shrunken, divided and reticulated over time by Israeli expansion and settlement. And it's worth noting that in the 16 years since the last of those pictures, the process has intensified to a considerable extent. So there are some of the highlights, or if you like, the lowlights of recent Palestinian history. A people essentially driven from their land in 1948 in the catastrophe at the foundation of the State of Israel, and then having the remaining territory occupied militarily after the Six-Day War of 1967, and continuing illegal settlements activity. What makes it illegal is the Fourth Geneva Convention, universally accepted as humanitarian law, which states that an occupying power must not transfer any portion of its population into the territory it occupies. So these are some of the background concerns, and clearly we have an occupied and marginalized and impoverished people who are living at the sharp end of injustice, which would remain only with them and known to them were it not for the role of advocacy by themselves and by others. And therefore it's a very close match for the circumstances set out in the earlier quote by John Paul Lederach for the entry of advocates and the effect they can bring about in circulating these concerns up and down the levels of a conflict-affected society. Now, another set of issues is in the next slide, which is more recent developments, and the picture shows part of one of the recent military attacks on Gaza. Israel presents these as being necessary for its own self-defense. This is an explosion of white phosphorus, which is again presented by Israel as necessary to illuminate targets on the ground to then be struck by other weapons, but in fact is one that inflicts a large number of grievous wounds that are very difficult to treat, burning wounds. And those attacks have been seen by, I think, a majority of the world community as unjustified, by many in the international community as both disproportionate and indiscriminate, making them potential war crimes as well. And at the same time, of course, we have, for example, a group in Israel called Breaking the Silence, which is testimony by members of the armed forces who took part in these attacks on breaches of international humanitarian law. No one is uninvolved, according to them. That is to say, their instructions, their orders on the ground do not permit them to discriminate between bona fide combatants and innocent bystanders, and they're told to unload their ammunition into all sorts of targets, including human targets and civilian targets. At the same time, the period has seen the end of the last attempt by an American administration under Secretary of State John Kerry to bring about a negotiated peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And many, again, I think, found a lot to echo in the statements issued by the chief Palestinian negotiator, Saeb Erekat, that Israel refuses to negotiate sincerely because as long as the status quo is so beneficial to it, Israel has no interest in a solution. Without firm signals from the international community, Netanyahu's occupation and colonization policies are incentivized. And that really is fundamental to the logic of the BDS campaign, because it's about really redressing that balance. It's about leveling the playing field by gradually and over time making it clear that there will be a downside if Israel continues its occupation of Palestinian territory, continues its illegal settlement building, and continues its military attacks on Gaza, because it will therefore sustain things such as a recent drop in foreign direct investment, which was discovered in a UN report and attributed by an Israeli economist who was one of its co-authors, partly to the rise of the BDS movement, and also potentially divestment by major multinationals such as the French company Veolia. Veolia has a lot of contracts with local government to do things like take bins away, including some in Australia, and it also operated the Jerusalem Light Rail project, which was a settler-only transport link, but it did divest itself of its holdings in that. There's an article that I've posted on the Blackboard site which gives some recent developments in Australia. And towards the end of that article, I also make the observation that, in a sense, there's a kind of dense weave of connections at different levels between Israel and countries in the international community, including Australia. And those connections are very evident in the work of universities. And I think the University of Sydney, in particular, is in danger of bestowing its good name unwittingly on a project to use those connections as a kind of camouflage to try to divert the attention of the international community away from calls for a change of policy and make it impossible to conceive of placing that relationship in a space where its continuation is conditional on a change of behaviour. So that's a very brief overview of the case for boycott, divestment and sanctions. There are lots of objections that people make to it. Among those are objections that people who might, for example, take up fellowships in universities might be potential partners for dialogue about changing the situation. But there are, of course, ample reading resources online. Indeed, if you put BDS into Google, you'll be in danger of being overwhelmed by references, including articles by people with many different points of view. May I therefore encourage you to immerse yourselves to the extent that you would like to do so, join in the discussion, and come back to me with any questions.